Hello, this is Tessa Kegel for HBS5OHC Hazardous Substances Management Systems, Chemical Hazards, Classification and Labelling, and this is Module 3, Part 3. This is the Commonwealth of Australia Copyright Warning Act, which you should be familiar with by now. Until recently, Australian hazard classifications have been based on a document entitled The Approved Criteria for Classifying Hazardous Substances. This was first published by the National Occupational Health and Safety Commission, or NOSC, in 1999, and then was updated in 2004, and it can be accessed through Safe Work Australia. Under the model work health and safety legislation, this has been replaced by the Globally Harmonised System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, or the GHS. The GHS classifies both substances and mixtures for physical characteristics such as explosiveness and flammability, health hazards such as acute effects, carcinogenicity, and environmental hazards. This system replaces material safety data sheets with safety data sheets, or SDS, and addresses how labels and safety data sheets should be used to convey information about their hazards and how to protect people from these effects. SDS are integral to the management of hazardous chemicals in the workplace and contain information on the risks posed by chemicals and ways to minimise these risks. As Australia moves to compliance with the requirements of the GHS, a number of practical changes to previous chemical and hazardous substance management systems have been introduced. One of the most significant of these is the inclusion of GHS pictograms and hazard classes in safety data sheets and labelling requirements. And you can see a selection of the various pictograms, which I've also used in some of the previous sections of this presentation. Safety data sheets, like material safety data sheets, have to present information under 16 predetermined sections. The safety data sheet sections are product identifier and identity for the chemical, hazard identification, composition or information on various ingredients, first aid measures, firefighting measures, accidental release measures, handling and storage of the chemical, exposure controls and personal protection, physical and chemical properties and any other additional parameters, stability and reactivity of the chemical, toxicological information, ecological information, disposal considerations, transport information, regulatory information, and any other information. And in this section, we have the date for the safety data sheet. Australia's previous national framework for managing chemical hazards in the workplace delineated between hazardous substances and dangerous goods. Hazardous substances were associated with human health effects, and dangerous goods were predominantly associated with physical effects, which often resulted in a single chemical being classified as both a dangerous good and a hazardous substance, therefore requiring compliance with two overlapping but different regulatory frameworks. The new national standard consolidates the control of health hazards and physical hazards arising from the presence of chemicals in the workplace. Chemical substances, mixed articles, can be classified as hazardous chemicals, a term that includes both health hazards and physical hazards. The key provisions for managing risk associated with the chemicals in the workplace are therefore contained within a single national standard, supported by specific codes of practice. The code provides guidance on how to comply with the requirements set out in the national standard for the control of workplace hazardous chemicals. The focus of the national standard and this code is on those substances and mixtures which could cause harm to people, property, or the environment. Those substances and mixtures which have been found to meet the criteria for one or more hazard classes of the globally harmonised system. Under the new Australian Model Work Health and Safety Regulations, the third revised edition of the globally harmonised system as the basis for chemical classification and hazard communication requirements has been implemented. During the 5-year transition period from the 1st of January 2012 to the 31st of December 2016, manufacturers may either use the globally harmonised system for classification, labelling and the production of safety data sheets, or the previous hazardous substances and dangerous goods classification systems, which include material safety data sheets. After the 31st of December 2016, all Australian workplace chemicals must be classified according to the globally harmonised system, and labels and safety data sheets must be updated. Now, new work health and safety legislation has commenced in New South Wales, Queensland and the Australian Capital Territory, the Commonwealth and the Northern Territory on the 1st of January 2012, and in Tasmania on the 1st of January 2013. But the other states are still waiting to implement this new legislation. In addition to the resources provided through the REACH system and the globally harmonised system, in Australia we have the resources of chemical databases which can be utilised to gain information about hazardous chemicals. One of these is the National Industrial Chemicals Notification and Assessment Scheme, which is fondly known as NICNAS. Now, I've put the URL for NIC on the PowerPoint presentation, and I'd encourage you to have a look at NICNAS and see what it has to offer. NICNAS is overseen by the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing, and it was established in 1990 to provide a national notification and assessment scheme to protect the health of the public, workers, and the environment from the harmful effect of industrial chemicals. It also assesses all chemicals new to Australia and assesses those chemicals which are already being used on a priority basis in response to concerns about their safety on health and environmental grounds. The resources provided through NICNAS include more than 2,700 scientific assessment reports that contain safety information for the handling and labelling of the chemical Chemical Gazette, which is published electronically every month, and the Australian Inventory of Chemical Substances, or the AICS, which lists more than 40,000 chemicals. NICNAS conducts chemical risk assessments according to the type of chemical notification received. For a chemical which is already used in Australia, a quantitative risk assessment measures the risk posed by the chemical, while for a new chemical, a qualitative assessment describes the risk. Now, just as a small case study of how NICNAS operates, in 2003, I was working at the Occupational Dermatology Research and Education Centre, which is located in Carlton. It's also known as ODREC. ODREC consists of clinics which specifically deal with occupational contact dermatitis, as well as education and research facilities. Now, we noticed that a number of the common sensitisers which were seen in the ODREC clinics were not classified as sensitisers according to the NOSC list of designated hazardous substances. We reported this to NICNAS, and in response, there was a great deal of work, great deal of effort but eventually what happened was that a number of the chemicals were actually listed as hazardous substances. This includes a chemical called glyceryl monothioglycolate, or GMTG. Glyceryl monothioglycolate is a chemical commonly found in perming solutions and used in hairdressing salons. GMTG has been classified as hazardous in the European Union. However, it wasn't classified as hazardous until our policy work. Now, as a result of our efforts, it is now also classified as hazardous in Australia and has the classification of R43, which is a skin sensitizer. Another hazardous chemical database is the Hazardous Substances Identification Scheme, or the HIS. I've put the URL for the HIS up on the PowerPoint presentation, and once again I'd encourage you to go to the site and have a look at what the HIS has to offer. HIS is overseen by Safe Work Australia. Under the Model Work Health and Safety legislation, manufacturers and importers of substances supplied for workplaces are required to determine whether they are hazardous to health before supply. This legislation being based on the approved criteria for classifying hazardous substances. These criteria are adopted from the European Community legislation for classifying dangerous substances. Prior to Safe Work Australia, NOSC published the list of designated hazardous substances, with the last edition published in 2004. HIS now includes access to an updated consolidated listing of classified substances. The HIS is summarised on the Safe Work Australia website as an internet resource that allows you to find information on substances that have been classified in accordance with the approved criteria for classifying hazardous substances, and or have national exposure standards declared under the NOSC adopted national exposure standards for atmospheric contaminants in the occupational environment. In addition to providing powerful search features, HIS also provides direct access to a consolidated list of all the classified substances contained in the HIS database. So, in conclusion, in this module, we have reviewed the fundamentals of chemical hazard management and related regulations and resources. And we've also reviewed how these might apply to workplaces. Now, as you know, there are different sets of legislation for each of the different jurisdictions in Australia. So it's important that you're familiar with the chemical hazard management requirements and all the related regulations which are specific to your particular jurisdiction. So this concludes the PowerPoint presentation for Module 3, but there are still a few readings and activities for you to complete. So reading and activity 4. Reading 4 is the OHSA 2003 publication, A Guide to the Globally Harmonised System of Classification and Labelling, and you can download this from the URL on the page. Now, we just want you to review this document. You don't need to read it in great detail, but you need to be aware of its contents. And then activity 4 is to watch the OHSA YouTube video provided as a separate link through LMS. Reading and activity 5. So reading 5 is a work covering New South Wales hazardous chemicals, asbestos and major hazard facilities PowerPoint presentation. So this is module 7 in the WHS Regulation Awareness course for union members. And this PowerPoint presentation can be downloaded from the URL on the page. And activity 5 is to watch the YouTube video, which is provided as a separate link through LMS. Reading 6 is to read the final section of Pisanello and Tepe from Risk Communication. So that's 4.5, page 27, until the end of section 5, to the end of the chapter on page 34. So these sections of the chapter cover risk communication and control of hazardous chemicals with reference to the hierarchy of controls and the use of appropriate expertise to assist risk identification, assessment and control process. Activity 6. So reading 6 listed 8 different types of experts you might use to assist with the process of managing chemical hazards within the workplace. For each of these 8 areas of expertise, can you think of an instance within your own workplace where they may have added value to information you required or the risk communication of control processes? How would you brief them regarding your workplace and the related management? And I'd like you to prepare this information and be prepared to share your thoughts about this in the Collaborate session. Reading 7 is the final reading for this module. It's a journal article from Kegel et al. And yes, it is one of my journal articles. It's from the journal Contact Dermatitis. And now the journal Contact Dermatitis is available through the eJournal section of the La Trobe Library page. But I'll also place the specific journal article on reserve in the library resources block in LMS. So you go to the library block on the right hand side of the LMS window and you can download the journal article from there. The final activity for this module is to look at Figure 1 on page 332 of Reading 7 and consider how hazard communication policy logic might operate for the two chemicals you chose in Activity 1. And I'd like you to be prepared to share your thoughts about all of this in the Collaborate session. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to speaking with you about this module in the upcoming Collaborate session.